No, you don't.
Yeah.
No, they pick up a lot. So, hey, all right. So welcome to another episode of the podcast. My guest today, live and in person, is AJ Thomas, pastor of Deepwater Church in Halifax, and AJ and I go way back. We've also done the product placement for Kingswood here, so that
Kingswood, the finest coffee.
we get the plug in for the school as well. So, hey, this is going to be fun.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it, man.
Yeah, let's just
Thanks for the invitation.
yeah, let's just chat and see where we end up going. So why don't you give us just for those who might not know you, although I know a lot of my viewers probably will.
You have
give
viewers. That's pretty cool.
Well, it varies. It varies from week to week.
A lot of my viewer knows you.
You're just gonna like take my numbers way up, I'm sure.
That's probably unlikely.
Anyway, we might be way too comfortable with each other for this, but give us a little bit of just kind of your spiritual bio, how you grew up, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so grew up here in Sussex, New Brunswick, from which we are coming to you today. And my father was the pastor of the Wesleyan Church here. And so I grew up in a very healthy, stable, happy Christian home. I'm kind of a rare PK in that we never moved. We came here when I was 1, and my parents stayed until I was finishing up high school. And after I graduated high school, then they moved, and so I grew up in church, in youth camp, in Sunday school, in all those kind of things. And when I was about 7 years old, I kind of made that sort of first step towards the Lord and asked Him to forgive my sins and to come into my life. And then when I was about 12 at Beulah Camp, I remember a guy was talking about sanctification, and particularly this idea of kind of giving yourself to Jesus, and so I decided that's what I should do, and did that. And then when I was about 15 years old, at a what was then called Booster Weekend, now Encounter.
Yes.
And I don't even know if you know this. You were preaching.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, you were preaching, and I don't remember the specifics of it. I think you told a story about a kid in New York City who like gave his shoes to a dude on the street.
Yeah, I remember that story.
Yeah,
actually.
yeah. And which book is it in? No, just kidding.
It's in my new book, which will be coming out soon.
Do you have any products? Usually this goes the other way, right? The guest is supposed to plug there, yeah. And yeah, I just really felt God calling. I didn't know what it looked like, what it meant, but I felt Him calling me to ministry, to give my life to this kind of stuff. And so that kind of began a journey of figuring out what that would look like, and had a few kind of road bumps, road blocks and speed bumps along the way. But for me, that was, again, more part of that maturing process in my faith of learning to kind of continue to say yes to Jesus. As someone who grew up in a Christian home and never really went through like a big rebellious turn my back on Jesus phase, or turn my, I hate my parents, so I got to hate Jesus too, or whatever. One of the things that I've experienced is that your yes to Jesus has to keep growing with you, because what it means to say yes to Jesus at 7 is different than what it means to say yes to Jesus at 12, which is different than what it means to say yes to Jesus at 15, which is different than what it means to say yes to Jesus at 19 or 20, and on through your life, because your understanding of what life is changes and grows, right? Like at 7,
yeah, that's a really good point.
At 7, I wasn't thinking about my career. I wasn't thinking about my marriage. I wasn't thinking about my family. I was just like, tomorrow in the sandbox, I'm going to try to love Jesus, right? And so as your world expands, as your life expands, what it means to submit that to Him, like you kind of have to, as you discover new territories within your life, you have to submit those to the Lordship of Christ as you go. And so I would say my journey with Jesus has really been defined more by those moments where you realize you've discovered new territory in what your life is, and then you have to figure out how to submit that territory to him. And so even that, like when I think of, while I was here at Bible college, oh, I'll give my whole life to you, Jesus. And then you have kids, right? And you're like, oh, what does it mean to give them to Jesus, right?
Right.
Because that's a whole, like, that's a scare. Like, they're my babies, and I got to take care of them. There's been times when I would have been happy to give them literally all the way back to Jesus since then. But at the time, but yeah. So that's kind of been my my journey, and not that I haven't had my my sins and my struggles to work through, not that I haven't had places to grow, but it's really been about continuing to come up to those, I guess, new understandings of the breadth of what my life means, and then going, okay, does my whole life still belong to Jesus?
Yeah, and you move. Yeah, we definitely have seasons and phases of life, and your season kind of determines your strategy and how you're gonna navigate things, I guess. And so I'm even at 63. Like you encounter a whole different set of things you have to say yes and no to in your faith than you do like when you're in your. I'm assuming you're in your 40s now.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah. So as you don't know what the phases are going to be as they're ahead of you, and and then you can look back and you can see all the things you said yes to. But they're different. So that's a really good point. Just kind of moving along. I think some people just kind of get stuck. They get stuck. The last time they said yes to Jesus was like 10 years ago, and they're just and they get stuck in that phase. And it's really important.
And the problem with that is you wind up with areas of your life that just aren't submitted to him, because they're areas that didn't exist before.
Right.
And so you're not even holding steady. You're actually losing ground. Right. Like
because you're not moving forward.
Like if I give 100% of my life to Jesus today, 10 years from now, that 100% is probably only going to represent 70% of what my life is now.
Right.
So yeah, it's not just the sad thing of stalling out in your relationship with Jesus. There's a real sense in which you start moving backwards.
Right. That's a good point.
It's Wesleyan school. We believe in moving backwards.
So you're kind of jumping ahead to where you are now. I know that you had a few stops along the way, but your primary ministry for a long time has been in Halifax in a deep water. So
yeah,
talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I worked on staff at a church in a suburb of Halifax in Cole Harbour called Hillside Wesleyan for about 5 years. And towards the end of my time there, what turned out to be the end of my time there, I felt like God was calling me to lead a team that would plant a church that primarily was trying to connect with people who didn't have a real meaningful church background. In the culture I grew up with, I always say there's two kinds of people who still went to church and people who didn't go to church anymore. And in Halifax, I started encountering this third category of people who just had no, like maybe for their grandmother's funeral or something. But I mean, I met people who literally they'd never even been to a wedding or a funeral in a church.
Yeah, Halifax is kind of like, it would have some parallels to like Portland or Seattle in the States.
I often, when I'm talking to Americans about Halifax, like, what's it like? I say, have you seen Portlandia? Like, that's a documentary about Halifax in a lot of ways. Yeah. It would be, think all the kind of typical things of a, progressive East Coast city. But then add to that the Canadian factor in terms of being post-Christian and that kind of stuff, like, a few steps closer to Europe than a Boston would be or whatever. And so, yeah, that's kind of the context there. And so we felt like that's what God was calling us to do. And so talked to the leadership of our church and our district, and they sent us out with a team of people and some money to launch this new church. And we decided to just head right to the center of the city, because we thought, like, if you want to reach young families, there's neighborhoods for that. And if you want to reach, middle-aged professionals. There's neighborhoods they tend to congregate, and if you want to work and serve among the poor, there are neighborhoods you can pick for that. But if your primary target is just people who don't really know anything about Jesus, like there's not a neighborhood they hang out in. There's not like oh yes, like that's Lostville or whatever.
Right.
And so we said, well, if we can't be where everyone is, we'll be where they're used to going. And in Halifax, everyone hangs out in whatever their little corner of the city is and downtown. So we went downtown, launched the church in 2007, and grew that along for about 7 years.
And you were meeting in a movie theater for
we launched in a movie theater, and that was a strategic decision based on the fact that there was nowhere else we could go. We looked into 40 different venues, and that was the only one that would actually let us come in.
So you took that as God's will.
Yeah, we really...
That door is open, so let's walk through it.
We got a whole, we got the pros and cons categories going. As I spent an hour or two with a whiteboard and landed on the fact that the place with the roof that will let us through the doors is the one for us. It did work out really well for us.
Right.
And we were there for, I was there for 7 years. Then the Lord... long story short, called my wife and I to resign our position there, and had no idea this is what was going to happen, wound up going to Bangor, Maine for 2 years to lead the merger of a couple of congregations there, and then also had no idea this was going to happen, but God opened up the door for us to come back to Deepwater, and that whole season was
and that's a pretty unusual scenario,
incredibly
right?
unusual. Yeah, it was weird and wonderful and good for us and good for the church. And one of those things that you could never orchestrate, like you could never say, like, I just need to go do something different for 2 years, and you guys need to figure a few things out, and like that kind of thing. But that's the beauty of, in our family, we always say, we do what Jesus says, and it turns out to be good. And you don't have to understand how it's going to turn out to be good at the time. You just need to do what he says. And so that's what we did, and it turned out to be really good. So now we've been back for 5 or 6 years and continuing to grow. Continuing to reach people for Jesus. Celebrate Recovery is a huge part of our ministry there. We have a ministry to recently incarcerated people. I probably have as many members with criminal records as most churches you'd ever run into.
Yeah, actually, the last time I remember being at your church, I think the guy that was running sound was a guy that I had met in Dorchester prison, and he was like, "Hey, Mike, it's great to see you again." And I was like, it was awesome to see him out and being productive.
Yeah, you guys walked in, like the Bible college crew shows up, and he's like, "Ah!" Oh wait, prison ministry.
Right.
Yeah, one of my favorite moments was we're sitting in staff meeting, we're getting ready to do baptisms. Another round of baptisms, and we're okay, who's setting up the tank and who's this and what are all the kind of logistical things, and then somebody had to go. The guy was our CR director at the time, Sean. He said, "Does anyone know how you'd find out if ankle monitors can get wet? Like, can they be fully immersed?
Right.
Like, or do we got to keep his leg out of the tank? Because we had a guy who was still wearing an ankle monitor who'd give his life to Jesus.
You have to hold him upside down.
It turns out they are waterproof. And
okay,
we know
all
that
right,
now,
that's
so
good to
it
know.
wasn't a factor. But yeah, that's a big part of our ministry there, and so.
And when did you guys bought an old church? And renovated? When was that?
So we bought that right before what we like to call our missions trip to Bangor, and have done multiple rounds of renovations. So there was a couple of years there where we used both the theater for Sundays and then the church for kind of midweek stuff. And then when I got back, we realized that we were spending a whole lot of money on the theater, and that was money we could be investing in the building. And not that it's about buildings, but it's certainly more about the building we own than the building we rent. I'll tell you that much.
Well, in February in Canada, you have to have a building. You can't meet under a tree. Right?
I remember, was it Francis Chan or something who did this whole thing about like, we just met outside. And I was like, in California, fill your boots. But, in Canada, wear your boots. You need your feet in there. You'll lose them to frostbite. So we bought this old church building, about 100-year-old building that hadn't been a church for about 30 years. That it had some parts of it converted into apartments, and some parts of it were used for First, it was a dance school. Then it was like a community theater, kind of just general hall place. All manner of things, wonderful and perverse, happened under that roof. We, normally when you buy a building, you dedicate it. We did that about 3 times, like just for good measure. We're going to pray through it. Then we're going to get some more people here and pray through it. Then we're going to get everyone here and pray through it. But yeah, it was this decrepit, fallen apart old building, kind of right at an interesting cross section in our town. It's on a street called North Street. And from North Street north is fairly upwardly mobile, young professionals. You get a few blocks north of that, and you into an area called the Hydrostone, which is like won awards for like nicest neighborhood in Canada and all this stuff. And it's, across the street from our church. That house is owned by a lady who's a Crown prosecutor. A few houses up from that used to be one of the members of Parliament for our area, lived there. But if you go a block or two south of North Street, you're in an area called Uniacke Square, which is like low-income government housing project kind of area. And the street we sit on is Fuller Terrace. When you cross north, it becomes Maynard. I've been told before, Maynard's one of the last streets in Halifax where you can buy drugs on the street. Normally you got to email a guy or something now, but you can just walk down the street and there'll be a guy, kind of a thing, And so it's a really cool kind of cross section there. And because the low income housing is there are tons of Syrian refugees that when they came to Canada here in a big wave a few years ago, who were placed in that housing, and so it's kind of this interesting cross section of kind of typical middle to upper middle. If you live on the peninsula, you're at least upper middle, kind of multi-generational white Canadian folks. And then you have Uniacke Square, which is more diverse because it's got generationally poor white people, generationally poor African Nova Scotian people, and very recently poor refugees from Syria. And it's really kind of a cool neighborhood. And then about 2 years ago, space is always an issue. We're always running out of space. We've never had enough space. Which is a major.
It's a good problem.
Yeah, it's a major problem and a good problem, but you got to solve it. And we really felt that rather than putting all our eggs in the basket of one big building somewhere, although I will take a bigger building in a heartbeat, we really felt like God was calling us to begin to spread out around the city. And so Halifax, for those who aren't familiar with it, is a harbor city. The whole thing is called Halifax now, but traditionally Halifax is one side of the harbor and the other side is Dartmouth. And so we launched a church in Dartmouth, wanted to be right downtown, wound up the only place we could find was further out in a movie theater, so we were there for 8 months. Then the pandemic hit and everything was shut down for about 16 months. Our whole church didn't meet in person that whole time. But then just recently we were able to begin reopening in Halifax, and then we partnered with a Catholic church in Dartmouth and reopened there 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think now.
Oh, okay, cool. And so they're meeting in a Catholic church?
Yeah, so it's the hall of the Catholic church, which is the basement. And the church is, the parish is the merger of a bunch of other parishes. They actually own 16 buildings. Not all of them are churches, but so they're trying to figure out what do they do with all this surplus of buildings. And some of the churches will end up being closed, the church buildings, but until that one is closed, we can't use the actual, what they would call the church, the auditorium, the sanctuary, whatever. When that happens, in theory, we can move up in there. We can meet there sometimes. We just can't meet there every week. So yeah, we're in partnership with a Catholic church there. I'm really good friends with the priest, and our rent check. They're very evangelical Catholics. The rent check that we pay there actually funds a full-time staff position for them for a director of evangelism and their primary tool for evangelism is Alpha. And so
Yeah, and our like the stereotype that most evangelicals have of Catholics is not like.
Yeah, I always say I was raised that, you got like there's Wesleyans, and then there's like Nazarenes, and then Pentecostals and Baptists. Like, we're theologically closer to the Pentecostals, but they scare us. We're
Right.
theologically a little further away from the Baptists, but they're pretty low key, so we're comfortable with them, And then you got like your Uniteds and Anglicans and Satanists, and then Catholics. Like, that was kind of the hierarchy, right? But Halifax is it's a unique city in general for the amount of unity and community there is among the churches. And so, I have lots of friends who pastor in different churches, but I mean all kinds of different, like, again, I've got 2 or 3 good friends who are Catholic priests, and we partner together on ministry stuff all the time. There's a Presbyterian church planter who uses our building at Deepwater. We've helped to fund Baptist and Pentecostal church plants in the city. And I think, some people look at that and go, oh, the church is so strong in Halifax. And there's a sense in which that's true, but it's a strength born of, like,
because of where you're at, right?
There's so much opposition.
You need to band together.
World War II, you can't go like, well, we're American, well, we're Canadian, well, we're British. Like, the Nazis are shooting either way, so we better figure out how to work together. But it's a beautiful thing because you start to realize, like, even with Catholics, we still have so much more in common in terms of our faith than we do with secular humanists.
Oh yeah, and the pastor that you were talking about, I think, is like he was. I've met him before. I was at a conference in the United States several years ago, and he was speaking, and he was the most evangelical
100%
speaker. He was more evangelical than all the evangelicals that were there. It was really blowing my mind.
He's
blowing
amazing.
My mind. Yeah,
he's amazing. One of the other Catholic priests that I'm friends with, a guy by the name of Rob Elford, Father Rob Elford. He was an Anglican pastor and wasn't really crazy about the direction the Anglican Church was going, so he wound up leaving the Anglican Church, served as a chaplain with former offenders, which is what got us into that work, partnering with him on that stuff. And God led him to the Catholic Church, had this mystical experience at the adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, and but still had this sense of a call to ministry. And so he actually went through the process to become an ordained Catholic priest, married, has 2 kids. But
I have a few friends like that as well.
Is a Catholic priest, and it's a fascinating kind of little technicality there that if you get married before you become Catholic, you can become a priest. And it's great. I love the kind of community that exists there. There's a group of 7 or 8 church planters in our city that meet together regularly. To my knowledge, only 2 of them are from the same denomination.
Right.
And it's great.
And you guys are launching a 3rd location too, right?
Yeah, we're right in the process. We adopted a church that was closing in our city, another Wesleyan church called Metro Wesleyan. They were in an area called BLT, insert bacon, lettuce, and tomato joke here, but Beachville, Lakeside, Timberley. It's kind of this little suburban area, 10,000 people in the immediate, like in the actual confines of BLT, and then probably another 5,000 around. And when they closed, basically we adopted them, made a very clear trajectory for a lot of their people to come and be a part of Deepwater if that's what they wanted to do. And the language we use is we adopted spiritual responsibility for that community. They really, the thing that was the hardest for them when the writing was on the wall that these were the last days for that church was, we really feel like this community needs to be reached, and we're sad that we're not going to be able to do that. And so basically we said, we'll shoulder that response. It's an area we had an interest in anyway. It's where I live. And so the assets from that church were sold off and went into basically a trust fund to allow us to launch a new campus out there in BLT. And I actually, later today, I pick up the check from the district.
All right.
So
always fun to pick up checks.
I might need some help with this one. It'll fund us for a few years. But so they didn't own a church building. They owned a parsonage, and that's where the majority of that that funding came from. But yeah, we've identified it. We've talked about it publicly. Funding's now in place. We're in the process of hiring site pastors for it. And Lord willing, just about this time next year, that will officially have they'll start meeting for regular Sunday worship.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll be out of this whole COVID thing. Who knows?
Lord willing,
along.
when we talked about that. Honestly, one of the things we said is we go, because our building again is very small. Our main kind of Halifax, the one we own, and we said if all this COVID stuff lifts and goes away, we'll regain some momentum, and we're going to want to be sending people out because we just don't have room, if for no other reason. I mean, also the gospel, but we just won't have room. And if it doesn't, and we're still have gathering restrictions, then we have even less room.
Right.
So
right.
we can only fit half as many people here, so we'll still need more space either way. So let's just go ahead and keep plowing ahead.
About it,
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's switch gears here a little bit. I know that you've been very open about this, and so I thought you'd be a great person to talk to. I went through, like when I was about 37, I went through some burnout and some issues with that, just because I was running so fast for so long and just kind of saying yes to everything because I really wanted to do it, and they were good things. But I kind of hit a wall there and had a period where I had to pull back, and I had to go on some medication, and all of those kinds of, and learn to pace myself kind of a lot better. Realized it wasn't a sprint that I was in, that it was a marathon or maybe even an Ironman sometimes.
This is so off topic. Have you, sorry guys, have you seen that whole thing about sharks and humans, the triathlon thing?
No, I haven't.
Sharks can swim faster than humans, but humans can run faster than sharks.
Right.
So in a triathlon, it comes down to which one of you is better on a bike.
Right, okay. That's a good point. So, bouncing off of that, I know.
So about sharks.
I know you've had some issues along those lines, and so
plenty.
Yeah, and so can you just kind of share that a little bit, because I know a lot of times it's just people just don't talk about it.
I looking back,
right.
I think I've had some tendencies towards mental illness for most of my life, but it was actually
which you're like really, you're very outgoing, you're very funny. Like people would not assume that; they would assume the opposite.
Yeah, generally, I don't come across as a depressed person.
Right.
But of course, which I do, I pay a lot of attention to comedy.
Right.
And one of the things you learn is the whole kind of
the Robin Williams effect,
totally,
right?
Yeah. The sad clown thing, right? And a lot of times people who develop a strong sense of humor, it's actually like they're trying to cheer themselves up, right? Which is not, I don't think that's an unhealthy thing to do, but it's one of those, it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have sadness. It means they are so desperate for a laugh sometimes they got to figure out how to create them themselves. But yeah, so I mentioned this trip we took to Bangor, those 2 years we spent in Bangor, and I was while I was there, I just kind of hit this wall where I was just very low energy. I had all these weird aches and pains that we couldn't otherwise diagnose, like working with my doctor. And so he took me through this kind of inventory thing that they do. It's like 18 questions that you answer that's how you're diagnosed with. It's not like there's a blood test for depression or whatever, right? And he said, you're clearly having a rough go, but you're not like clinically depressed.
Right.
Oh, okay, cool. So I just carried on with my life. And I went to our district's ministerial, like our annual pastors gathering. And this is about 5-6 months later. And the guy who spoke at that ministerial was, terrible. Like just horrible. I've never heard someone make mouth noises that long that didn't communicate anything. And
hopefully no one will do the math and try to figure out who it is.
My friends know exactly who it is. But yeah, not a bad person. I've heard them speak in other contexts, and they did great. It was just like everyone has an off day, and that person had it really hard 3 days in a row. And I remember driving back home to Bangor by myself and going like, what is the point of life? Why go on? Not like suicidal, but just like, why ever get out of the bed in the morning? And why, like, there's no hope in this world whatsoever. And then I realized, like, I grew up in church my whole life. I've heard a lot of bad messages, and never have they made me despair of
Right, they
existence
were triggers,
itself.
right,
Like,
right.
I've never walked out of a terrible sermon and gone like, God, why did you even create this world? You know? And I was like, oh, something's going. So I went back to my doctor and we went through the evaluation again, and I scored 17 out of 18.
Wow.
The only thing I didn't have was like suicidal
Right.
ideation. And again, not because it's not, I've been at those points where I can understand why people are suicidal. I can understand why I've never been at the point where I felt like that was the thing I wanted to do, but you know, I've been close enough that I can see it from here, kind of a thing. And even little, like one of the questions is, have you been engaging in reckless behaviors? Because it's kind of that one of the signs of depression is you stop really caring, right? And I thought about that for a minute, and I realized it hadn't been a conscious decision. But about 3 months earlier, I just stopped wearing a seatbelt. And it was,
Really?
yeah,
Wow.
it was just this like,
Yeah.
yeah, whatever. Like if it happens, it happens. You know what I mean?
Wow.
Yeah, like so yeah, I was in pretty rough shape. So I started in on some medication, and that made a really significant difference for me really quickly. Like they're like, it could take up to 6 weeks for you to feel any difference. And I took my first like dosage and went to bed and woke up the next morning like just the world was alive for the first time in a long time. And I did in 36 hours, I did a complete study through the Psalms. Like I was just like, you know, like, and then that evened out
Right.
around hour 48. And yeah, I kind of found some equilibrium again and some productivity again. Like I'd gotten to the point where I'd go to the office and try to get some work done. And I had zero resilience. And so I'd try to print something, and it turns out the printer's out of paper. I was done for the day.
Right.
Like literally, I'd just go home and go to bed. Like that happened at 11 o'clock in the morning. That was that was all the disappointment and opposition I could handle
yeah.
for the day.
So you had no margin at all.
None. No, like there's no bouncing back
Right.
from anything, right? And but yeah, so the meds kicked in and worked great, and that was a huge help for me. I didn't choose to seek therapy at the time because my sense was, and still is, that it was a primarily chemical thing for me in that moment. I'll talk about, you know, I've also had some experiences with anxiety that were completely not, like they were very much situational due to life circumstances as opposed to just a chemical thing. But yeah, so kind of carried on and things were pretty good. When it was coming to the end of our time there, we knew we were only there for 2 years. We were there kind of like on a grant from our district. And the opportunity to come back to Deepwater came up. And Deepwater, it's challenging, it's draining, it's hard. It's good, but it's hard. And so I went and talked to a therapist then, and I said, all right, I need some wisdom. What should I do? We're trying to figure out what's next. And, you know, I love Halifax, I love Deepwater. It's, you know, from a skills and gifts perspective, it's the perfect fit for me, but it's incredibly draining. And so should I go back and do something like that that's a really good fit, or should I find something that's less emotionally draining, less hard on the head, you know, leaves me with maybe a little more margin more often. And this, I can't even remember this lady's name. I only talked to her once. She was so sharp, and like we talked for like 10 minutes, just like, oh, who are you? How are you? Okay, let's start your session, kind of thing. And she knew just from that. She looked at me and said, go back to that church. And I said, are you sure? And she said, yeah. She said the boredom of something else will kill you way before the work of the church. And I said, oh, great, thanks. Like this is like 10 minutes into the session, right? And I'm like standing up. She's like, no, sit down. I'm like, oh, okay. So I sat back down. She said, how are things going with the depression in general? You know, at first I thought she really cared about me, and she probably did. But I also realized I'd probably paid her for an hour, and she thought she should give me my money's worth. So I said, oh, great. And she said, you know, I said I have hard days now and then, but, you know, way more days are good than bad now, and that wasn't the case before. And she said, oh, what's the same about those bad days? I said, oh, nothing, they're just kind of random, you know. She said, well, think back. What's something common about them? And so I started mentally, I think I might have actually pulled out my phone and looked at my calendar, and I was looking back and I went, most of them are Tuesdays and occasionally a Saturday.
Oh, interesting.
And she said, so what's the same about Tuesdays? I said, that's my day off. She said, oh. And Saturday? I said, well, if there's work to be done, I do it. And if there isn't, I don't. That's kind of a bit more of a loose end sort of day. She goes, oh, do you have any hobbies? And at the time I didn't. I said, no. I said, I've looked into stuff. I've tried. I just haven't found that thing, that hobby yet. She said, do you like your job? I said, I do. I like my job. Do you enjoy it? I said, yeah. I said, it's got its moments, but yeah, I like it. She said, oh, quit taking a day off.
Okay.
Yeah, and this is a Christian counselor, like you're expecting the Sabbath lecture, right? She's like, quit taking a day off. I like, okay. She said, I'm not saying like schedule stuff. Don't do meetings. Don't feel like you got to be into the office by a certain time. But she said, what your brain is starved for is dopamine. Right. And for you, the good parts of your job give you dopamine. So if it's like sleep in on Tuesday, take a relaxing, but if it'll come 11 o'clock in the morning, if you're starting to be bummed out, like go to the office for 2 or 3 hours, get something done. It'll cheer you up. So that's what I did. And it made a huge difference. And eventually I found a hobby, and that's what I do on my days off now. I do woodworking. But yeah, it was some of the most helpful and counterintuitive advice I've ever received. So I was on meds for 4 years for that. And eventually came off those meds, which is a horrific experience. If you've ever done that, it can be really, really brutal. And then about 1.5 years ago, I'll go into a lot less detail on this story, both for time and because it involves other people. But we went through just an incredibly challenging and stressful situation, and with one of our children. And it just, in Newfoundland, they'd say, me nerves is rubbed right raw. Right?
Oh, me nerves.
Yeah, me nerves is rubbed right raw. And it toasted me. Yeah. And in the good words of Dr. Lee, like I was just on constant high alert. And so now it wasn't depression, it was anxiety. And
it was kind of situational.
Very much. It was like
an external source.
When people come to talk to me about mental health, particularly depression, they'll say, am I like depressed, or am I like, do I need to seek treatment, or am I just, and I'd always say, like, there's two kinds of depression. There's depression because of a chemical imbalance in your brain, and then there's depression because your life is terrible. Right. And if your life is terrible long enough, it will mess up those chemicals. Right. But they'll be like, I don't know why I'm so sad. Like, my mom just died and I lost my job. And I was like, this is not a mystery, right? Like meds might not be the first step. We might just need to grieve some losses.
Well, and we are meds are always like the default in our culture. Totally. So I would see them somewhere down the line from first for sure.
Well, again, figure out what it is. And then and sometimes the truth is people are in situational stuff. But at this point, they're so far over their head that some meds for a season.
Yeah, we'll kickstart it.
Or just help them keep their head enough longer, head above water long enough to work through the actual. If you've got a lifetime of childhood trauma, you might need a little help to kind of keep your head. I always think of it like you're drowning, right?
Right.
And it's like the goal is to get you back to shore. But in the meantime, meds might be the life jacket that keeps your head above water while we're getting you back to shore. But yeah, so depression was there were things that contributed to it just in terms of work being draining and stuff. But no traumas, nothing to process through. No big, this was whatever. But the anxiety was very much just I was put in a situation where I was on high alert. It had been a bit of a challenging season at work, the kind of thing where I could use a week off.
Right.
So I booked a week off and started my week off on Wednesday. On Thursday, they started talking about this something virus something.
Right.
And on Wednesday, the whole world on Friday, the whole world shut down, and I had to come back to work and figure out how do we do church now. Yeah. Then things continued to go.
Which would cause a little bit of anxiety.
Well, it just, again, not in a place of a ton of margin at the time. So we got that all sorted out and, kept pushing forward for another month or two. And then, again, I don't want to, I'm happy to talk about my stuff.
Yeah, right. No, I understand. Totally.
But some of the situations we went through with our son kind of went to a whole other level. and that really more than anything else. Like I wasn't coming into it in the greatest space, but you know, I've had people ask me when we were getting ready. I wound up taking 7 months off, back on different meds, lots of therapy, just hyper vigilant. Like my that whole fight or flight or freeze thing
Right.
was just cranked constantly. And I often said to my wife, "Man, I preferred being depressed."
Right, 'cause
When you're depressed, you just go to
it's
bed.
a little more relaxing.
Totally, right? I'm like, it's like at least I can still be chill, right? Like I would much rather just lay in bed in despair than be like, are the window like I would go around our house every night and make sure every door was locked, every window was locked. I was and no rational reason for that. I had nothing that happened with our son was connected to that. I just constant like paranoia kind of a thing. Was like didn't want to leave the house because what if something happened to the house, and then didn't want to go out because what if I see someone and I don't have the like
Right.
emotional
And you kind of
wherewithal
know
to
that
talk
this
to
is
them.
irrational, but it's still
Totally,
happening to you,
100%.
right? Yeah.
Which that's one of the things that I say to people when it comes to dealing with mental health issues. I always talk about I have an old Jeep and the check engine light's just always on.
Right.
And the reason the check engine light is on is not because there's anything wrong with the engine, it's because there's something wrong with the sensor.
Right.
And so one of the kind of thought exercises that's helpful when you're dealing with depression, anxiety, those kind of things is to go like, okay, try to get enough objectivity to go, is there something wrong with my engine?
Right.
Or is it just the sensor?
Right. Yeah.
And mental health issues, to me, depression and anxiety it's a malfunctioning sensor, right?
Right.
And so again, sometimes it is because life is terrible or whatever. But like even with there were reasons that I got to a place of that level of anxiety, but those things didn't justify that level of anxiety.
Right.
That blew out that sensor. And so my check engine light was going like, the whole thing's going to catch fire any minute now.
Right.
When the truth was, it was like, we put in some real hard miles there for a while, you know? And so learning to not trust your feelings, you know, to go like, that's just my check engine light, but I know the engine itself is actually fine. Just that sensor.
Yeah, I've been driving like with my check engine light on for like 4 years now. So
Totally.
Because I know there's nothing wrong with the engine.
Yeah,
right?
I don't even notice it anymore. Right. Like,
yeah.
I had new catalytic converter put in, and it shut off for 2 days, and I was like, "What in the world's wrong with my dashboard?" It's like, "Oh, there it is. It's the warm, comforting amber glow of the check engine light." So yeah, back on meds, 7 weeks off work. When I was diagnosed with depression, we didn't have to take any time off work. Part of that, I talked about the way, you know, God knows what's going on. Being where we were at in Maine, the workload
it allowed you
was
to
so
do
much
that.
lighter.
Yeah,
It gave us the margin to do that. So our church was incredibly gracious, gave both, my wife works at the church as well, gave both of us 7 months just to go home and do woodworking and talk to Dr. Lee and take medication and process. And went back to work in January, just, you know, almost a year ago now, and had a great time. And still on meds, not in a rush to get off them. If the day comes when I think that makes sense to do. For me, with the first time I was on meds, it was basically I just kept doing the math on do the benefits still outweigh the side effects?
Right.
And I got to a point where it was.
And what would some of the side effects be like?
Yeah, we had a great conversation with Pulse today about constipation.
Okay, just some physical side effects.
Yeah, physical side effects for the most part. Yeah,
right. Okay.
Yeah, there's other ones too that probably don't belong in this podcast, and that's from a guy who thought constipation did. But yeah, you have some of these side effects, and it just got to the point where it was like I feel pretty good,
right?
And I don't think I need the help anymore,
right?
And I'm more bummed out by dealing with these side effects than I am everything else in my life.
So did you have any like thoughts or like how did you kind of marry what was going on with your theology or with your like Christian, you know, because some people wrestle with
totally
with like, what is it as a Christian, you know, I'm depending on God and prayer, like what is it, how does all this fit together?
A lot of your feelings are biological,
right?
And people assume that you feel from your spirit,
right?
And there's a sense in which you do, but you feel from your brain. like we think of this as the rational part of our head, and it is rational, but that's where the feelings actually happen on a chemical level.
Well, everything's all interconnected too. Like you you have neurons in your gut and in your heart,
100%.
and it's like there's more in your brain, but they're all communicating.
That's
with each
actually
other.
why SSRIs cause constipation, is because their whole thing is to tell serotonin receptors to relax.
Oh, okay.
And it's actually the serotonin receptors in your gut that tell you it's time to go.
Right.
And so your actual digestive process is going, bro, it's time.
Right.
And your meds are going, dude, don't worry about it. It's fine. Literally, I have a friend who's a pharmacist, and he was like, do you know why that is? I was like, no. And he's like, did you know that like the same stuff that's in your brain is in your colon? And
so the whole point is we're very holistic.
Yeah, people have accused me of the same stuff that's in my colon being in my brain before. But what's the rating on this? Are we still good?
Oh, we'll have to make this one a little higher than PG.
Sure,
maybe. No.
sure. We're PG 11. We don't need to go the full 13. But anyways, yeah. And so there's a comedian named Chris Gethard who I don't recommend. But a big part of his stuff he talks about is his own mental health. He's had crazy amounts of mental health issues. And he actually helped me through. I mean, I don't know the guy, but just listen to the stuff he helped me with this idea a lot. He has no faith of any to speak of that I mean, he's like got a little bit of Catholic guilt, but I think that's the closest thing he has to faith. But one of the things that he said is, if someone's diabetic, that means there's a chemical that their body should produce that it doesn't, or that it produces but its body does not process properly. That's insulin. And so what do? You take something that either makes your body produce more insulin or process that insulin better or replace that insulin, depending on which medication you're talking about. And he said, depression and anxiety are the exact same thing, like literally the exact same thing. There's a chemical that your body usually produces that makes you well, and it's either not producing that or your body is not processing that properly. And so you take something that helps to change how much of that your body makes or how your body processes it. And for me, that was just that, to say to someone with, again, clinical depression or clinical anxiety, like diagnosed, that you should just have, if you really trusted Jesus.
Yeah, and people shouldn't self-diagnose because there is a huge difference between
talk to your doctor.
Between like clinical depression and just
100%.
feeling sad for a few
100%.
days, right? Yeah.
And frankly, not being willing to talk to your doctor about that is a sign that you don't take it seriously. Like you would never self-diagnose with cancer. Right? You would never self-diagnose with colitis or whatever, right? You'd go to and so some people are like, I don't need the doctor's validation because I know that. It's like, no, you do actually. And you need their help. So, but yeah, I would say that understanding that there is this very chemical component to it, and it is a very physical thing, means to say that, if you really trusted Jesus, you wouldn't be depressed, is the same. Literally, it's the same thing as the kind of prosperity gospel.
Right.
Of if you really trusted Jesus, you wouldn't be sick, right?
If you take any medicine or go to the hospital ever,
totally, yeah,
this on the same kind of level.
100%.
Yeah.
Like if you're going to tell me that I shouldn't take, I don't know, whatever my medication is, I don't even remember what it's, Cerera or something. I don't know. If you're going to tell me I shouldn't take that, you should also tell me I shouldn't take my diabetes medication.
Right.
I take allopurinol for the gout because I'm old.
Right.
You should, by that same logic, if I really love Jesus, I wouldn't have the gout or whatever.
Right. And the goal is to, like, if we can go without being on any medication at all and everything's working great, like, that's great. Like I aim for like no meds, but if something goes wrong and I need meds, I take them.
100%. Yeah, the goal the goal is health.
Right, the goal is holistic health.
And sometimes in any form, medication makes up for a kind of health you otherwise can't get to. Sometimes it helps you get to a place of health,
right?
Where you don't need them, and sometimes. When that health is accessible without meds, it's actually a less healthy thing to lean on those meds.
Right.
But again, that's one of those areas where, lean on the input of professionals, right? Like no one is going, for my kidney issue, I really feel that's like, no, you
Right.
go to your doctor and you take their advice and you trust their expertise.
And so it's kind of just like the spiritual aspect of it is kind of like, yeah, I pray and I take the meds. Like I,
100%.
like
Yeah,
you
no,
know,
totally. And
yeah,
and I again, like I trust
yeah,
Jesus
yeah.
and I talk to a therapist. Like
Right,
I
right.
I talk to Jesus and Dr. Lee.
Right.
Like I that's
And
not
both are helpful.
I should be clear. I'm not saying Dr. Lee is a plug for Kingswood. He was the counselor that helped me in this most recent season. And yeah, it's not an either or, and it's not a lack of sensitivity. But I would say, back to what you
Right.
were talking about, how it's all interconnected. That check engine light thing, like mental health will make you feel like there's something wrong with you spiritually, and I think it's really important for people to understand. No, like you're not necessarily far from God just because you feel far from God. You're not necessarily disconnected from God because you feel like I'll have people who will come to me and they'll say like I don't really feel like I can connect with God right now, and I'm going through this thing of mental illness. I said, who do you feel like you can connect with? Like, nobody. I'm like, exactly.
Right.
Like that's your mental illness, not your
Right.
spiritual state, right?
Right.
Or they're like, I try to pray and I can't focus. Like, what do you focus? Oh, I can't focus on anything. It's like, that's not because you don't love Jesus. That's because you're mentally ill, right?
Right.
And so the best thing you can do to fix yourself spiritually is actually to lean into what's most healing for the mental health issue that you're having. But it is, I mean, it's 100% true that we tend to talk about ourselves in this kind of trichotomy. Is that a word? I don't know. But
Yes, it is a word. Actually,
the body, soul.
Yeah,
You're the
yeah.
English prof. The body, the soul, and the spirit, or the body, the soul, and the mind, or kind of however we want to lay those out. And yeah, the truth is, there's a reason the devil tends to tempt people when they're overtired and when they're hungry, because you're weaker then, right? Like he knows
Right.
that the state of your body actually lowers the
And I've
defenses of
noticed
your heart.
isolation as a huge factor
Yeah.
in that attack as well.
Which is
Yeah.
which is one of the things with the temptation always with mental illness is to isolate.
Right.
Either because you feel like you can't handle the interaction, or because you feel like the other person won't understand. Whether that's they'll be confused or they'll judge. Like there is still, at least in certain areas and lots of corners of the church, this is still the case. There's a lot of kind of stigma or whatever around mental health stuff, which is, I mean, I talk about my mental health, first of all, because I don't have a filter. Second of all, because it's fodder for good jokes. But third of all, because I just go like, okay, I'm not that I'm some big deal, but I lead a growing church and have some level of credibility in the circles that I operate in. And if it's okay for me to be very publicly mentally ill, my hope is that for people in my congregation, people in my circles of influence, students that I had the privilege to talk with the last couple of days here at Kingswood, that will give them a sense of freedom or comfort to at least be mentally ill in a small group. Like if I can talk about it in front of 80 students, hopefully they can talk about it with 2 or 3 friends at least, right? If I can tell them about my mental illness with 200 people listening in, hopefully they can come talk to me about their mental illness one-on-one, and try to address it and move forward.
Yeah, and get help.
Figure out how to get help. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we should probably, I know you have some students waiting to have lunch with you, so we should probably bring the plane in for a landing here somewhere. This last season has obviously been hard on everybody, and particularly like a lot of pastors I've talked to, hasn't been their easiest or most favorite, season of ministry. So if somebody is a pastor or leader and they're struggling, and you could just say like one thing to kind of encourage them, what would that be?
There's this old adage in ministry that it's about faithfulness, and I'll be honest with you, most of the time I think that's bunk. I'm just like, that's just an excuse to not get anything done, right?
Right.
It's like, what were you faithful to do?
Right.
But the truth of the matter is, like, I'm very future oriented. I'm very like strategic oriented, And for me, one of the things I had to grieve when this pandemic hit was
I'm glad you used that word, because I've had a real sense of like I'm future oriented as well,
Yeah.
and I realized that
and
like
occasionally you like to go places.
yeah, and I've been grieving the loss of a lot of things that I used to do that are just I'm locked out of right
Well,
now.
that's literally the language I use.
yeah.
I said, I miss the future.
Yeah.
Like I used to live in the future.
Right.
And I can't live in the future anymore. And that's been really hard for
Yeah,
me.
even like tomorrow what you think is going to happen tomorrow,
100%.
chances are some outside force will change that.
Yeah, drastically.
Right.
Not just make it harder, make it illegal.
Impossible.
Like that kind of thing, yeah.
Like maybe like a Thanksgiving dinner or something.
Sure,
Who knows?
So I guess one of the things I would genuinely say, though, is nobody knows how to do this. And I remember early in the pandemic, it's interesting how these people have since shut up. Like 2 months in, there was all these like the gurus were like, here's what you need to do, and here's what's going to change. And it was like, you don't know. Literally, this has never happened before. Like people, the Spanish flu is like, I think the rest of the situation was a little different then, right? This just never happened before. No one's ever led a church through this before. There are other people who are doing it now with you, but no one's done it before. No one knows what they're doing. No one, like we won't know for years who actually did this right. And so just relax and do your best. Love your people. And again, in this moment, on a more heart level, I genuinely like just be faithful to what you've been called to do. And don't stress out about how different it looks than what you thought it looked like when you said yes to doing it, which maybe brings us full circle back to that yes thing, right?
Right.
To yes to being a pastor is very different than yes to being a pastor in a pandemic.
Right.
And when I said yes to Jesus, we did not talk about COVID-19. We didn't talk about being shut down for 16 months. We didn't talk about, having to have arguments with people about vaccination stuff and all like, and so there's a very real sense in which there has to, okay, I will also pastor during a pandemic. I'm still saying yes. Right. And if someone out there is struggling with that stuff, I mean, my advice on the professional front would just be relax, cut yourself some slack.
Just hang in there.
Don't think that the other people who seem like they're doing it right actually know what they're doing, because they don't. They're just making it up. Within a prettier package as they go along than you are. And then on a personal level, reach out. Don't like one of the narratives that pastors in particular tend to tell themselves is I'm the helper, not the helpee.
Right.
Or in a time like this to go like, I couldn't, everyone's going through their own stuff. They're dealing with their own stuff, right? But from your own experience, if you're a pastor, those aren't mutually exclusive. Like you can be going through your own stuff and helping someone else through their stuff. And so whether it's, I would say this too, whether it's COVID related or not, if you're a pastor particularly and you're having some sort of mental health issues, whether diagnosed yet or not or whatever, I'm happy to chat about that. And I don't have email. That's part of how I maintain my mental health. I was gone for 7 months, and when I got back, I was like, let's not turn my email back on for a couple of weeks until I get caught up on all my other work. And then I went, you know what?
2 weeks to flatten the curve. No, 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Just never came back.
Let's just delete my email.
Right.
And we did. And so people were like, how can I email? I was like, you can't. Sorry. You email the office. So yeah, email the office at Deepwater. They'll get you, I am reachable. info@deepwaterchurch.com would get you there. But if you go to deepwaterchurch.com, you can find that. This is not I love you. This is not an invitation to pastor everyone who ever watches this. But particularly for those of you who are pastors, because I know you don't have a pastor you can go to your own pastor. But if you don't have one, and you're a sister or brother in ministry, I'd be more than happy to have some of that conversation with you and figure out what's next, or just commiserate with you, tell you my war stories, and you feel less alone.
Awesome. Well, thanks for taking the time to do this, AJ.
Thank you,
appreciate it. And I hope you guys enjoyed our conversation.
Before you shut off the camera, Mike, yes. I know you're going to edit this out after because you nailed that ending. But I want to always take the chance to thank you, man. And you've been such a big part of my spiritual formation. Today in Pulse, I shared that manifesto thing. And it didn't occur to me till I was reading that in front of you how much of those ministry instincts are shaped by you. And so thanks, man.
Hey, I really appreciate that. Yeah, it's this has been kind of a discouraging time for me. You can imagine trying to run an outreach program when
Oh,
no
yeah,
one will let
totally.
you go out.
What if we had a program
and
where
so-
you could go places? That's great, Mike. What if we had a program where you
So-
go places, but you're not allowed to go any places?
So it's been a discouraging time. So I take all the encouragement that I can get for sure. So
You're the man, old man.
all right, let's turn the camera off. Well, that was fun.
I'm glad you felt that way. I know Debbie Benson.